There has been a whole bunch of drama this week about the Northern Gateway pipeline. There's been stories in the media of First Nations groups approving of and then disapproving of the pipeline. But what has really happened this week is it's got people talking. It's got people talking about what exactly Northern Gateway is, why this pipeline is a big deal, and what maybe reviving it, could bring for sort of the Canadian economy. On this channel, though, we're not necessarily interested in just the Canadian economy. We're more interested in investing in Canada. And there's one specific company that's part of my portfolio that we've talked about here on the channel that is very, very tied into the story of Northern Gateway. And of course, it's Enbridge. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of Northern Gateway, talk about some of the drama that's holding it up, and then we're going to talk about what we could do if maybe we would expect Northern Gateway to get back on track. Welcome to Golden Arch Investing. My name is Liam, and on this channel, we love to talk about investing in Canada. If that's something that interests you, please do subscribe to the channel. It means a huge amount. It doesn't cost anything. I'm going to break this video down into a couple of parts. First, I'm just going to sort of talk about the Northern Gateway pipeline, and I'm going to use that name, even though whatever comes in this sort of discussion might not be literally the Northern Gateway pipeline that was originally proposed more than a decade ago. Second, I'm going to talk about the two companies that I'm personally invested in that I think could benefit hugely from a pipeline of this type going into the ground. And then third, I'm going to kind of talk about what my sort of expectations really are, regardless of all the noise that we're getting in the media. If any of that interests you, feel free to skip ahead to catch up to whatever section you're interested in. So first, what is the Northern Gateway pipeline? Now, if you're watching this video, you're likely pretty into the world of Canadian investing. You probably know a good chunk about the Canadian economy, and specifically, you probably know a good chunk about sort of the story of Canada's many doomed pipelines. Something I've talked about a couple times in passing here on the channel, but I've never really delved into. And to be honest, it's a little before my time, right? I'm in my 20s. This all happened about a decade ago now, when I was still a teenager. The Northern Gateway pipeline was canceled back in 2016, which was sort of the culmination of a bunch of things that had happened. The first thing was that the previous federal government under Stephen Harper apparently hadn't done enough consultation with groups that were impacted. These groups definitely wanted to let people know they were not okay with the way that this pipeline, and really it's not just the pipe in the ground, but it's the infrastructure on the far side that was their problem. Right? They were not interested in having this big run of pipeline through the ground that would then have, huge oil tankers coming up and down BC's north coast. They also didn't want to risk any of the sort of beautiful parts of the country and all the water that runs through there. If you're not familiar with northwestern BC, it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful part of the country. I've been there a couple of times. I love camping there and exploring. They've got rainforests and mountains and glaciers, and it's just absolutely fantastic. So I very, very much respect that it is a part of the country we want to protect. The problem is that Canada is in a position where we have a lot of resources on the interior of the country that we're trying to get to the exterior, and it seems that this northern gateway, this northern passage through the Rocky Mountains to the west coast, to the ocean, to the Pacific, is the most convenient route available right now. And so it's likely the one that we're going to talk about for a while. Now, obviously, there is the Trans Mountain pipeline that has been expanded. It goes down to Vancouver, so sort of the southwestern coast of BC. But I don't think that so soon after the massive expense that was building that pipeline, there's even going to be discussion of expanding it. So I think this Northern Gateway is probably the only discussion we're going to have about pipelines going from the interior of Canada, from that sort of Alberta, Northeast BC, through to the ocean. It's probably just this Northern Gateway route. And so with that sort of in mind, with the fact that it was Indigenous consultation, it was environmental worries that had sort of held up this pipeline, we have to acknowledge that things have changed significantly since 2016. The narrative has changed a lot. The way people talk about the economy versus the environment has shifted. There was a period of time where the economy was doing well and the environment was a huge priority. And it seems like, based on all the discussion in the political media in Canada, that the economy is most people's number one concern right now. And that might come at the expense of the environment. If people are willing as a sort of consensus across Canada to reopen negotiations like this Northern Gateway pipeline, we could see many such projects come across the desk, and that would be potentially built out over 10 years. So let's jump to the companies that I think are going to be impacted by this, and sort of the way that I, as a shareholder of two of these companies, plan on sort of negotiating and navigating through all the different challenges and the questions of these pipelines. First one is Enbridge. This was originally Enbridge's plan. Northern Gateway is the name Enbridge gave it. That original plan that was scrapped almost a decade ago was Enbridge's plan. And so it stands to reason that if this pipeline, for lack of a better word, if this route to the ocean is reopened in negotiation, it's going to be Enbridge leading the charge. But they're not likely to be alone, because clearly the federal government has shown an appetite for allowing more Canadian resource exports to the global market. Clearly our American partners are, have very famously today said they don't need our resources. And so I could see that potentially the federal government would be incentivized to help Enbridge build this pipe. We're also likely going to see a very different federal government from the government under Justin Trudeau in the next little while. Obviously, Trudeau is out. There's a new leader being picked for the Liberal Party, and there's also likely to be an election in the not-so-distant future. With the exception of the NDP, it seems that whatever candidate is picked is likely to be more in favor of this pipeline than the previous government. So it is likely that the federal government is sort of leaning towards more in favor of focusing on the economy, and this would undoubtedly bring value to Canadian workers who help build the thing, and to Canadian companies who are then going to own it and run oil out to the ocean. Now, Enbridge obviously is unlikely to do this without some significant guarantees. They already got burned once by this exact plan, and they're not going to open this up for no reason. And so the final important player that I think is probably going to have their hands in this pie is the Alberta government. I live in Alberta right now. The Alberta government has done quite a job of demonstrating how pro-oil they are and how much they're willing to sort of stand up for this industry in Alberta. And it's likely that the Alberta government is, if this project was to happen, the Alberta government would be supporting it either financially or, subsidizing it in some way, or making sure permits get through in some way, or putting pressure on British Columbia, whatever it might be. It's incredibly likely that the Alberta government would financially and physically support this project going through. And I seriously doubt that Enbridge would even consider it without some serious government support. I'm not certain what the government of British Columbia might do. Any sort of pipeline like this has just this blend of governments all involved, and of course our First Nations who live right along the line that this pipeline was going to take involved in this process. So there's all these different players that have the ability to stop the project, and all have to be in alignment for it to happen. So in order for Enbridge to risk that money, they need to have guarantees from all the major players that it is going to happen, and it's not going to be held up like Trans Mountain was, or killed like Northern Gateway was previously. So if Enbridge was able to put this in the ground, what do I think that would do for the company? Well, there's a couple big things. First, this would be a premium asset that likely would have been put in the ground at, hopefully, what is a discounted price for this company. I imagine that if they do this, they need some serious support, like we were talking about. So I assume they would be able to build this at a much cheaper price than we saw with TMX, which would mean they would have a premium product, but wouldn't need to be recouping so much from the investment. So there's no world that this gets built for something in a reasonable price range, right? There's nothing that gets built across the Rocky Mountains that doesn't cost an exorbitant amount of money. Especially giant infrastructure like this, you'd have to build up more export capacity at Kitimat. There would be all sorts of challenges. But with the support of the governments, it's possible that Enbridge could build it at a more reasonable price. If Enbridge then was able to turn around and make a serious profit off of this, it could be a huge profit driver for the company. And obviously, it could help Enbridge in a world where the American, oil dependence narrative has been broken, where that sort of investment thesis that, hey, the Americans are gonna need Canadian oil because they've got these refineries that depend on heavy oil. If that narrative gets broken, Enbridge is in real trouble, because that's a lot of their infrastructure. Not all, sure, but a lot of their infrastructure is specifically focused on that trade. And so if that narrative is broken, if that thesis is gone, a lot of investors are going to be looking for something else that Enbridge is able to offer them. This would be a solid offering. It also would have some more long-term implications, right? Where the Canadian oil sands are these, energy assets that are expected to last for decades and decades. Not like the shale oil boom that's expected to peak and then start to sort of decline over the next 10 years. So if this asset was able to be put in the ground and well maintained, we could see this driving profits for half a century, which would be absolutely fantastic for a dividend growth company like Enbridge, who's just working on constantly building up more and more free cash flows with this sort of utility like balance sheet, and owning these huge assets that are just consistent, constant profit drivers, right? Enbridge doesn't need to grow, but if they're in the position where they can, there's no reason they shouldn't. Now, the other company I want to talk about is CNQ. And honestly, I'm just using them as an example of all of the upstream Canadian oil producers. So the people actually taking the oil out of the oil sands and then shipping it off to be refined, usually in the States, but in this case, obviously, to be sent off to Asia or just the markets of the Pacific in general. One of the challenges these companies have faced is that Western Canadian Select crude, WCS crude, that sort of Canadian Alberta-based basin of crude has always been discounted compared to WTI, sort of the base price of oil, because we only really had one option to sell this oil to. And I say we, I mean Canada. Canada only really has been shipping almost all of its oil straight down to the States. And while that is part of the big tariff drama with the United States right now, it's also a huge detriment to companies like CNQ. If they were extracting the same oil somewhere else in the world, it's quite possible they'd get a much nicer price for it. And that would allow them to drive much more profitability. If you think of these companies as currently being very profitable, dividend growing, free cash flowing machines, well, just imagine if all of a sudden that differential was cut in half. Maybe I'm being too optimistic there, but I could see that Western Canadian Select crude would have less of a differential in the long term. And again, these oil sands assets have decades of time, right? We're not going to run out of that oil for a long, long time. Now, oil price isn't going to stay stable. It never has. But just seeing that differential closed would make these companies much more profitable in the long term, which is what this pipeline could potentially do. So, final sort of thoughts here. Is this going to happen? I doubt it. And I doubt it because it's kind of like you're trying to get a lock to open that has a million different numbers. And you have to get every single one aligned for that to work. Like I mentioned earlier, we got 2 provinces, a federal government, and just a whole host of communities, and particularly First Nations communities, along this route that have made it so politically challenging to get this pipeline built. And even if you could convince them all for a small period of time to approve this pipeline, it's unlikely that Enbridge would be willing to take the risk. Because if 4 years after, when the next government is elected, they cancel the project, that's billions of shareholder dollars that is lost in a moment because of some sort of political challenge. So do I think this is going to get built? Probably not, unless things get worse. Unless we end up in a position where Canadians are so politically incentivized to prioritize projects like this and to get off of our reliance on the United States, that we actually invest on a project that I would assume would take, how long did TMX take? A decade, maybe, to build, right? Just like an astronomical amount of time to get up and running. I would assume that this will probably not get done, and definitely not in a short time frame, but it is a possibility. And if you see news like this, that and we saw sort of rumblings this week that have sparked all the drama, but if you see like solid, consistent news that plans of a pipeline along this route that, let's be honest, probably won't be called the same thing, actually get built, that different levels of government are agreeing and the communities have aligned themselves, don't be surprised if you see Enbridge on the way up, if you see CNQ, and just the whole industry in Canada benefit massively from a project like this. And that's about all I have for you folks today. If you enjoy this kind of video and you like talking about investing in Canada, please do subscribe to the channel. Talk about Canada every single week on here, and just love doing it. So please do subscribe. And like the video, helps us out a huge amount in the YouTube algorithm. And the final thing I'm going to say here, if you think this project's going to get built, or if you think there's another project even more likely to get built you'd like to sort of hear my thoughts about, please do leave it in the comments down below. I'll toss a pinned comment up just so that we can sort of have that discussion, because I'm interested what people think. I'm still so skeptical, but it might just be because basically my entire life the story has just been no more pipelines. Obviously change is coming, but we'll see how quick. And with that being said, that's all I have for you folks today, and I'll see you in the next video.